And the Reserve Bank of India's first pilot for an electronic rupee will be launched tomorrow. This is its version of the Central Bank Digital Currency. A statement said that it would be issued in the same denominations that paper currencies and coins are currently issued, and it would be distributed through intermediaries like banks. Users will be able to transact with the e-rupee through a digital wallet offered by participating banks and stored on mobile phones or devices. The statement adds that the pilot will test the robustness of the entire process of digital rupee creation, distribution, and retail usage in real time. And now joining me to talk about CBDC is George Gammon. He's a real estate investor and entrepreneur and a macroeconomics expert. Now, George, I know you've talked a lot about all the concerns, associated with CBDC, but let me ask you, is the biggest concern for you that the digital money is programmable? Is this the biggest concern?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Because then what this does is this allows the Federal Reserve, the central planners, or the authoritarians to control how you spend the money, how fast you spend the money, and what you spend the money on. And it also allows them to really determine individual monetary policy. So for a moment, let's just assume that you had a carbon allowance, right? Or the government said that we don't want you using more than X amount of fuel per month. Well, then what they could do is they could, one of two things. Either they could, once you get to that allotment, let's say on day 20 of a 30-day month, they could simply cut off your ability to spend your quote-unquote dollars or Fed coins on a gasoline or beef or whatever they deem as to be dangerous. Or what they could do is they could make it prohibitively expensive. So they could also say that, okay, we'll allow you to buy that steak that you want, but instead of $10, you're going to have to pay $20, or we're just going to decrease the amount that you can have to allocate to whatever it is that you want to buy and they don't want you to buy.
Now, I can see this maybe in an authoritarian country, maybe in communist China. Do you believe the U.S. government would do this?
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of the proof that I'd give you is just recently in a tweet from the Federal Reserve, they really celebrated the fact that the Canadian Central Bank is holding a conference. And it was a conference on, it's basically a woke conference on equity, inclusion, diversity, all these buzzwords that come down from the global elite. And you can see very quickly how if they're moving this direction, if society in general is moving in this direction, and if we have a central bank digital currency, which is really a liability of the Federal Reserve or the central bank, which has an infinite balance sheet, that they can go ahead and extend credit, not necessarily based on merit, but based on narrative. And I think that's definitely where we're headed. And I think in the future, we could head towards some sort of lockdown situation or climate change, as an example, just like we saw during 2020. And the way that they would enforce these lockdowns or prevent you from leaving the country is by simply banning cash and having a central bank digital currency. So you can go ahead and leave, or you can, but your money can't. Or you can go outside, but you're going to be penalized by having the the amount in your account decreased, or by punishing you by not allowing you to spend on things that you usually spend on based on your monthly consumption habits.
Wow. And I want to ask you how we can push back against this in a little bit, but I also want to ask you a practical example in today's context. We know the Fed is trying to lower inflation, right? If CBDC existed right now in the U.S., what could the Fed do with that?
They could just decrease the money supply. They could increase taxes would be one way to do it. Just kind of giving a hat tip to the MMTers there. They would like that. But they'd have to decrease the money supply. They would have to, or decrease the velocity. That's another thing that they could do. But they could also monitor or manage interest rates on an individual level, like we were saying earlier. So although the going rate for mortgages right now, let's say, is 7%, if you use a certain amount of gas per month or eat a certain amount of beef, then your interest rate would be 10%. And therefore, you're reducing the velocity, you're reducing the extension of credit, which theoretically would reduce the money supply and bring down inflation. They could do several things along those lines, but it would be even easier to create inflation to bail the government out of their massive debt load.
And they could just issue more CBDC, right? It would be extremely easy.
Well, they'd increase velocity. So what they'd do is they'd say, okay, we'll give you universal basic income of, let's say, $2,000 a month, but you have to spend it within 10 days. And if they see that inflation isn't high enough to bail the government out of their debt, then they could simply say, okay, well, now you only have 5 days to spend it. And you can see kind of this narrative shifting away from a 2% price target with the Federal Reserve. And a lot of these Fed officials now are coming out and saying, well, I don't know if 2% is the right number. Maybe it's 3%, maybe it's 4%, maybe it's 5%. And this is because the debts are just so astronomical. So right now it is true that the CPI is 7.7%. But if you look at the yield curve, the inversion of not just the 2-year and the 10-year, but right now the 30-year Treasury is inverted with the Fed funds rate, the overnight rate. And so what this tells us is that the rate of inflation will most likely come down very dramatically to a point possibly where the Fed would want to increase it. But the bottom line here is this gives them the ability to not only micromanage the economy, but micromanage everyone's lives.
So how do we push back against this? Is it possible to not use the CBDC? What if I just use cash, or if they ban cash, can I just use credit card?
You hit the nail on the head. Cash is the answer. And it sounds very antiquated and old school, but if we've got to push back against them banning cash, because that's really, or any type of purchasing power that's outside of the banking system. So that could be Bitcoin, that could be gold. We have to have something outside of the system. So if they try to enforce these draconian rules, there's always a way around that, right? If they're giving you Fed bucks every single month in the form of UBI, and they say, okay, well, you've hit your allotment because of your carbon score or whatever it is, then you would have a purchasing power outside of that system to go ahead and fill your car up with gas if that's what you needed to do. So the key, and what it really boils down to in the system that we have now, although I think gold and Bitcoin are great to have some purchasing power outside of that system, is just if or when they try to ban cash, we have to push back against that.
And adoption for a CBDC would only be successful if people use it, right? If people don't use it, they can't do it.
Yeah, but I think that this is going to come along with universal basic income. So people will be incentivized. And I think they could also lower interest rates to a level that's far lower than the market rate would produce on something like a mortgage, as an example. Because again, the Fed has an infinite balance sheet. They can have negative equity. So they don't really have to worry about being paid back like a normal bank would. So they could undercut the going interest rate. And I think that there's a lot of things they can do to incentivize people to basically take their dollars that they currently have, which are liabilities of a commercial bank, and move those dollars to now be a liability of the Federal Reserve. And that's really the key component of a central bank digital currency.
And just one last thing, George. I'm curious if there's any positives to digital currency. Could it potentially offer greater insight into how money circulates in the economy? Do you think this is a worthwhile trade-off?
No, because the current system that we have is basically, it already is digital currency. And so the only thing that a central bank digital currency would add to that is, to your first point, programmable money. And then also that money existing on the Fed's balance sheet is a liability. And I don't see any upside to that.
All right. Thank you very much, George Gammon. Great seeing you.
Thanks for having me.